1985. The desert highway stretched out like a ribbon of forgotten dreams, shimmering under the relentless Arizona sun. Officer Daniel Stone gripped the steering wheel of his patrol cruiser, the worn leather warm, beneath his calloused palms. The air conditioning, perpetually on its last legs, wheezed a lukewarm protest, doing little to combat the suffocating heat. He wasn't supposed to be out this far, not on a routine patrol, but the call had been specific, hushed, and laced with an urgency that had bypassed the usual channels. "Meet me at the old lookout near Copperhead Canyon," a voice had whispered, barely audible over the static of the landline in the deserted precinct. "Just you, Stone. Don't tell anyone." Daniel's gut churned. It was the kind of meeting that usually ended badly, the kind that screamed trap to any seasoned cop. But the voice had been that of a desperate man, a source he'd cultivated over months, someone who promised to expose a truth Daniel had been chasing for years, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the dusty town limits of Redemption Ridge. He'd left a cryptic note for his wife, Sarah, just in case. Gone fishing. Back by dawn. A flimsy lie, but one he hoped would buy him time. The cruiser, a sturdy but aging Ford LTD, rumbled over the uneven asphalt, kicking up plumes of fine red dust that painted the stark landscape. To his left, the sheer drop of Copperhead Canyon plunged into a dizzying abyss, its ancient striated rock faces bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. Shadows were beginning to lengthen, stretching like skeletal fingers across the desert floor. He squinted, the setting sun a fiery orb on the horizon, casting long, distorted shapes ahead. Was that a glint of metal? A flicker of movement by the makeshift barricade of boulders near the old scenic overlook? His hand instinctively drifted to the revolver holstered at his hip. A cold dread, familiar yet sharper than usual, prickled at the back of his neck. This wasn't going to be easy. He slowed the vehicle, the tires crunching on loose gravel as he approached the turnoff for the lookout point. The silence that followed the sudden decrease in engine noise was deafening, broken only by the distant caw of a raven. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. Then, without warning, a heavy thud reverberated through the chassis. The car lurched violently to the right, tires squealing against the loose earth as it careened off the narrow shoulder. Daniel fought the wheel, his muscles straining, but it was too late. The world tilted, the endless sky merging with the canyon's jagged rim. The last thing he saw was the unforgiving edge of the precipice rushing towards him, before the groan of twisting metal and the sickening crack of rock became the only sounds, swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the canyon. 2015. 30 years. A lifetime for some. An endless purgatory for Kyle Stone. He sat hunched over his laptop, the sterile glow of the screen illuminating the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. He was a software engineer, his days filled with logical algorithms and predictable outcomes, a stark contrast to the gaping, illogical void his father's disappearance had left in his life. He'd been 5 when Daniel vanished, a vague, comforting presence in a uniform, then suddenly gone. A missing person. No body, no trace, just a lingering ache, a question mark branded onto his soul. The phone vibrated on his desk, a jarring interruption to the quiet hum of his work. He glanced at the caller ID, an unknown number from Arizona. He hesitated, then answered, "Kyle Stone." "Mr. Stone, this is Sheriff Miller from Redemption Ridge County." The voice was gruff, weary. We believe we found something. In Copperhead Canyon. A vehicle. Looks like an old patrol cruiser." Kyle's breath hitched. His heart, usually a steady drum, hammered against his ribs. The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy, laden with 3 decades of unanswered prayers and whispered fears. My father's car," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. "It matches the description, Mr. Stone. Deep in the canyon. It's been down there a long time. They're trying to get to it now, but the terrain is rough. We just thought you should know." The phone felt impossibly heavy in Kyle's hand. After all these years, the canyon had finally decided to give up its secret. A cold dread, mixed with a flicker of desperate hope, settled deep within him. It was a call he'd both dreaded and longed for. A call that promised either devastating finality or the first thread of a truth that had eluded him for too long. He looked around his quiet apartment, a sterile oasis of order. Suddenly, it felt suffocating. The ghost of his father, a phantom presence he'd carried his entire life, was no longer just an echo. The canyon had spoken. And Kyle knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to go back. The drive to Redemption Ridge was a journey back in time, each mile peeling back layers of the life Kyle had built, exposing the raw, tender wound that had never truly healed. The Arizona landscape, once a blur of endless highways and distant mountains, now felt strangely intimate, the stark beauty of saguaros and red rock formations holding echoes of his childhood. He remembered his father pointing out constellations from the truck bed on clear nights, the scent of pine needles and damp earth clinging to his uniform. Those memories, once comforting, now felt tinged with a cruel melancholy. As he turned off the interstate onto the old county road, the air grew thick with the familiar smell of dry earth and creosote bush. The modern world began to peel away, replaced by dusty signs for forgotten motels and boarded-up diners. Redemption Ridge had once been a bustling hub, a small town thriving on the promise of nearby mines and the charm of its untamed beauty. Now it was a ghost of its former self, its spirit faded like a sun-bleached photograph. The main street, once vibrant with the chatter of locals and the rumble of pickups, was eerily quiet. Storefronts stood vacant, their windows opaque with dust. The old movie theater marquee where he'd seen his first cartoon was a skeletal frame of rusted metal, its name long gone. He drove past the house where he'd grown up, a modest ranch-style home with a porch swing that used to creak a lullaby on summer evenings. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown, a testament to decades of neglect. It was a punch to the gut, a visual representation of the emptiness his father's absence had left behind. He parked outside the Redemption Ridge Sheriff's Department, a squat brick building that hadn't changed since the 80s, save for a newer, more sterile sign. Inside, the scent of old coffee and disinfectant clung to the air. Sheriff Miller, a man with a tired face and eyes that held the weight of too many years in law enforcement, met him at the counter. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. "Mr. Stone," Miller began, his voice gravelly, "I'm truly sorry it's taken this long. We never stopped looking, not really. But that canyon, she doesn't give up her secrets easily." Kyle nodded, his throat tight. "What exactly did you find, Sheriff?" Miller led him into a small, cluttered office. On a table lay a few items carefully arranged. A shattered piece of dark green metal, corroded by water and time. A faded, almost unrecognizable police emblem. And a fragment of a seatbelt buckle, still stubbornly attached to a piece of shredded fabric. "We sent a specialized recovery team down. They're still working, but it's definitely your father's vehicle, Mr. Stone." The VIN matched. Kyle reached out, his fingers hovering over the emblem. It was almost too much to process. the physical manifestation of a mystery that had tormented him for 30 years. And my father was anything? Miller sighed, his gaze dropping. No remains. Not yet, anyway. The vehicle is severely compromised. It's been at the bottom of a ravine, under tons of shifting sediment, for decades. If he was inside, the elements would have, well, decomposition would be extreme, but we'll keep looking. A hollow ache settled in Kyle's chest. No body. The same agonizing uncertainty. When did he disappear exactly? November 12th, 1985, Miller stated, his voice flat. Off duty as far as the official report went. Said he was going fishing. Miller paused, then looked at Kyle, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Though, if you ask me, Daniel Stone wasn't the fishing type, not that night anyway, not out on Copperhead Canyon Road. Kyle looked at the sheriff, a new unsettling chill creeping up his spine. What do you mean? Miller leaned back in his chair, a slight frown creasing his brow. Daniel was a good man, Kyle. Honest. Maybe too honest for this town sometimes. He was working on something big, something he kept pretty close to the vest. Right before he vanished, there were whispers about a new operation in town. Big money, and some very dangerous people. He picked up a pen, tapping it rhythmically on the desk. The official story was he drove off the road. An accident, but I always had my doubts. He knew that road like the back of his hand, and he never drove fast. Miller's gaze drifted to the dusty window, a shadow of regret crossing his face. Never sat right with me, son. Not one bit. The next morning the desert air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of juniper and distant dust. Kyle found himself riding shotgun in Sheriff Miller's battered Ford F-150, heading out on the very road where his father had last been seen. The early light painted the mesas in hues of rose and ochre, deceptively beautiful against the grim purpose of their journey. Sheriff Miller, with a thermos of black coffee between his legs, offered little in the way of small talk, seeming to understand the gravity of the moment. The turnoff to the old lookout point was barely a track, choked with thorny brush and loose rock. Miller engaged the four-wheel drive, the truck groaning its way up the incline. The air grew thinner, the silence more profound, broken only by the crunch of tires and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Kyle felt a tightening in his chest, a strange mix of apprehension and a morbid curiosity. This was Inhut, the place where his father's story had ended, or at least paused, for 3 decades. When they finally reached the overlook, the scene was a desolate tableau of geological grandeur and human intrusion. The sheer drop into Copperhead Canyon was breathtaking, a jagged maw that seemed to swallow the light. Below, far below, the recovery operation was still underway. Tiny figures like ants moved slowly around a glint of metal that was, impossibly, the twisted remains of his father's patrol car. A yellow crane, looking like a toy from this height, was attempting to lift sections of the wreckage from the ravine. A young deputy, his face smudged with dirt, met them. "Sheriff, Mr. Stone, the forensics team is almost done with the preliminary assessment. It's a miracle we even found it. With all the rock slides and flash floods over the years." Kyle walked to the edge of the overlook, carefully approaching the safety barrier of strung-up tape. He looked down, the immense scale of the canyon making him feel small, insignificant. He could just make out the mangled remains of the cruiser, barely recognizable as a vehicle. It was a twisted, crushed heap of steel, a testament to the brutal force of its descent. A forensic investigator, a woman with keen, intelligent eyes, approached them, wiping sweat from her brow. "Sheriff Miller, Mr. Stone, my name is Dr. Anya Sharma. We've completed the initial survey of the vehicle." She paused, her gaze softening slightly as it met Kyle's. "It is indeed the 1985 Ford LTD patrol vehicle, registered to Officer Daniel Stone. The VIN matches, and we found a few personal effects that correspond with his service records." She held up a clear evidence bag containing a tarnished, slightly bent police badge. Kyle recognized the design immediately. It was his father's. A wave of nausea washed over him. "And my father?" Kyle asked, his voice barely a whisper, dreading the answer. "Were there any remains?" Dr. Sharma shook her head slowly, regret etched on her face. "No, Mr. Stone, nothing. Not a single bone fragment, no tissue, no trace of human remains within the vehicle or within the immediate debris field. Given the impact and the amount of time it's been down there, it's puzzling. The vehicle's structure is compromised, but not to the extent that it would completely obliterate a body." The words hung in the still air, heavier than the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. No remains. It was both a slight, agonizing relief and a crushing, bewildering blow. If his father had been in the car when it plunged into the canyon, there should have been something. Even after 30 years, the very absence screamed a new, more unsettling question. "So, what does that mean?" Kyle asked, his voice raw. Dr. Sharma adjusted her glasses, her expression thoughtful. "It means, Mr. Stone, that either the body was completely disintegrated by some extraordinary localized force, which is highly improbable, or your father wasn't in the car when it went over the edge." Sheriff Miller, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "Or, if he was in it, someone removed him before the car was pushed. Or, if he got out somehow, then where did he go?" The canyon wind, a mournful whisper, seemed to carry those unanswered questions on its breath. Kyle looked from the twisted metal below to the vast, empty expanse of the desert. The official story of an accidental plunge felt flimsy, a thin veil over a truth far more complicated, far more sinister. His father hadn't just vanished. He had been erased. And the canyon, in revealing the car, had only deepened the mystery, making it colder, darker, and infinitely more personal. The ghosts of the past, he realized, were not just whispers. They were solid, undeniable facts, and they were just beginning to reveal themselves. The revelations at the canyon overlook, coupled with Sheriff Miller's veiled remarks, had ignited a spark in Kyle that had long been dormant, a burning need for answers. The journey back to Redemption Ridge felt less like a retreat and more like a tactical advance. He booked a room at the town's only functioning motel, a place that felt suspiciously familiar, then began his self-appointed mission. This wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about truth, about the integrity of the man who had been his father. His first stop was the Redemption Ridge Public Library. It was a small, quiet space, smelling of old paper and dust, a digital relic in an increasingly digitized world. He spent hours hunched over microfiche readers, scrolling through decades of local newspapers, his eyes aching from the strain. He started with the days leading up to November 12th, 1985, meticulously scanning headlines, obituaries, and police blotters. The initial reports of Daniel Stone's disappearance were brief, almost dismissive. Local officer missing, presumed accident. The tone was matter-of-fact, lacking the urgency and concern one might expect for a vanishing police officer. Kyle found it jarring, almost as if the town had collectively sighed and moved on, accepting the narrative too readily. But as he delved deeper, sifting through the mundane local news, a pattern began to emerge. In the months before his disappearance, articles about Operation Copperhead, a multi-agency task force targeting illegal mining operations and suspected drug trafficking in the remote canyons, began to appear. His father, Officer Daniel Stone, was frequently mentioned, lauded for his integrity and tenacity in investigating these illicit activities. The article spoke of increased patrols, intelligence gathering, and a growing sense of unease among the local illicit players. One name kept resurfacing: Wade Blackwood. He was an enigmatic figure, the owner of a sprawling ranch and a seemingly legitimate hauling business that transported minerals from the local mines. But the newspaper articles often hinted at more. Anonymous quotes from concerned citizens suggested Blackwood's operations were expanding far beyond legal limits, often touching on disputed land rights and aggressive business practices. He was never directly implicated in any crime, but his name was consistently linked to the shadowy underside of Redemption Ridge. A quick search on the library's archaic computer yielded no criminal record for Blackwood beyond a few minor infractions, parking tickets, a property dispute, too clean for a man so often whispered about. Kyle felt a growing knot in his stomach. His father, a man of unwavering principles, would have been a direct threat to someone like Blackwood. He imagined Daniel, with his quiet determination, chipping away at Blackwood's empire, one piece of evidence at a time. Had he gotten too close? He found an interview with Sheriff Miller from 1985, a younger, less weary version of the man he'd met yesterday. In the article, Miller expressed full confidence in the ongoing investigation into Officer Stone's disappearance, though the words now felt hollow, almost rehearsed. There was no mention of Operation Copperhead in the post-disappearance coverage, no connection made between Daniel's investigative work and his vanishing act. It was as if that part of his father's life had been neatly excised from the public record after November 12th. Later that evening, back in his motel room, Kyle spread out his findings on the worn desk. Old newspaper clippings, photocopies of police reports, a printed map of the canyon. The pieces of the puzzle were disparate, but a faint image was starting to form. His father wasn't just missing, he had been silenced. And the official narrative of an accident felt less like a conclusion and more like a carefully constructed cover story. The realization was chilling, but it also brought a strange clarity. He wasn't chasing a ghost anymore. He was chasing a killer. Armed with his fresh batch of theories, Kyle returned to the Redemption Ridge Sheriff's Department. The initial politeness from Sheriff Miller had been appreciated, but Kyle sensed a deeper reluctance, a wall of unspoken history that needed to be breached. He didn't just want answers about his father. He wanted to understand why those answers had been so effectively buried. The same bored-looking deputy from yesterday was behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. He barely looked up as Kyle approached. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with anyone who was on the force back in 1985, Kyle stated, trying to keep his voice even, though his pulse quickened. "Especially anyone who worked with Officer Daniel Stone." The deputy sighed, slowly pushing his phone away. "Most of those guys are long gone, retired, or, well, passed on. Sheriff Miller's the only one still here from back then." "I've spoken with Sheriff Miller," Kyle pressed, "but surely there are others. Even if they're retired, they must still live around here." The deputy shrugged, his gaze non-committal. "Maybe. Don't know their contact info offhand. We don't exactly keep a retired officer's directory for public access." The dismissive tone, the subtle barrier, was unmistakable. Kyle persisted, detailing his findings from the library, mentioning Operation Copperhead and the name Wade Blackwood. The deputy's casual demeanor hardened almost imperceptibly. His eyes flickered, a momentary tension tightening his jaw. "Look, Mr. Stone, your father's case was closed. It was ruled an accident. 30 years ago. There's nothing new here." "Except his car was just found, with no body, and the official report looks a little too neat," Kyle countered, his voice rising slightly. "My father was investigating something big. Are you telling me no one else remembers that?" Another officer, older, with thinning gray hair and a paunch straining his uniform shirt, emerged from an inner office drawn by the raised voices. He wore a badge with the name, Detective Riley. His eyes, sharp and wary, settled on Kyle. "Everything all right here, Deputy?" Riley asked, his voice low, a hint of steel beneath the casual tone. "Mr. Stone here wants to reopen a cold case from '85, the deputy explained, a smirk playing on his lips. Riley's gaze was a chilling appraisal. "Officer Stone's case, huh? What makes you think there's anything to reopen?" Kyle repeated his concerns, the inconsistencies, the whispers about Blackwood, his father's involvement in Operation Copperhead. He watched Riley's face carefully. There was no surprise, no curiosity, only a calm, almost impenetrable facade. "Look, son," Riley said, his voice flat, "I wasn't here back then, but I know the story. Tragic accident. Daniel was a good man, but sometimes good men make mistakes. Drive too fast, take a corner wrong." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Some things are best left buried. You understand?" The message was clear, delivered with a thinly veiled threat. Kyle felt a cold wave wash over him. This wasn't just indifference. It was active resistance. The way Riley looked at him, the way the deputy had shut down, it wasn't merely about an old, inconvenient case. It was about protecting something, or someone. The realization hit him with the force of a blow. It wasn't just criminals outside the law who had a stake in keeping his father's disappearance a secret. It was potentially people within the system. He suddenly remembered Sheriff Miller's earlier words. Maybe too honest for this town sometimes. The chilling implication was that his father's honesty might have been a liability, not just to the criminals he pursued, but to those who perhaps benefited from, or quietly tolerated, the shadows that had always crept along the edges of Redemption Ridge. "I understand perfectly," Kyle said, his voice quiet but firm, a sudden resolve hardening his jaw. He picked up his bag, his eyes meeting Riley's. "But I'm not leaving until I get some real answers. And if they're not here, I'll find them somewhere else." As Kyle turned to leave, he felt the weight of their combined stares on his back. The air in the sheriff's department suddenly felt oppressive, heavy with unspoken truths and long-held secrets. He stepped out into the bright desert sun, but the chilling sensation of unseen eyes, of shadows within the department, clung to him. The hunt for his father's truth had just become infinitely more dangerous. The chilling interaction at the sheriff's department left Kyle with a sour taste and a renewed sense of purpose. If the official channels were dead ends, or worse, actively obstructing, then he'd have to rely on his own instincts and the faded echoes of his father's life. He needed something personal, something untouched by official reports, or the filter of those who wished to keep secrets buried. His mother, Sarah, had kept a few boxes of Daniel's belongings after his disappearance, tucked away in their attic for decades, too painful to sort through. Kyle had never dared to open them, the weight of their contents too heavy. Now, as he walked back to his old family home, the house of peeling paint and overgrown gardens, a grim determination settled over him. It was time. The key, still under the chipped ceramic bird by the front door, turned stiffly in the lock. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and phantom memories. Every creak of the floorboards, Every shaft of sunlight cutting through the grimy windows seemed to resurrect a fragment of his childhood. He saw his mother laughing in the kitchen, his father reading him bedtime stories in the living room, the faint scent of his aftershave still lingering in the quiet corners of the house. He went straight to the attic, a forgotten space under the eaves. Cobwebs clung to the rafters like ancient lace. He found the boxes in a shadowy corner, labeled simply, "Daniel." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the first one. It was heavy, filled with books, old fishing gear, the typical detritus of a man's life. In the second box, beneath stacks of worn uniform shirts and faded photographs, he found it. A small, leather-bound notebook, its pages thin and yellowed with age. It looked like a diary, but it wasn't. It was his father's professional logbook, not the official kind, but a personal one. A place where he jotted down observations, hunches, and names that probably never made it into formal reports. Kyle sat on the dusty floor, the notebook resting heavily in his lap. The first few pages were routine, minor infractions, traffic stops, local disputes. But as he turned the pages, the entries grew more cryptic, more intense. Dates and times, followed by coded descriptions. Blue 83 F-150, late nights, Old Quarry Road. Unmarked CR plate, out of state 30 miles north of town. Meeting confirmed. Slim, 2 feathers, new money. Then the name he'd seen in the newspapers, etched into the rough paper in his father's familiar, precise handwriting, Wade Blackwood. Below Blackwood's name, Daniel had scrawled a series of unsettling notes. Property acquisitions, aggressive tactics, too many accidents on parcels near his land. And then a direct observation. Blackwood's hauling business, unusual movements of heavy equipment through canyons after dark. Not just ore. The implication hung heavy in the silence of the attic. Not just ore, smuggling, drugs. Something illicit, flowing through the very arteries of Redemption Ridge, under the cover of a legitimate front. One entry dated just days before November 12, 1985, sent a jolt through Kyle. Contacted source, whisper. Confirmed large shipment expected through Copperhead Canyon. Blackwood personally overseeing. Meeting set. Old lookout. Need to verify details before bringing to Miller. Can't trust everyone. Can't trust everyone. The words reverberated in Kyle's mind, echoing Sheriff Miller's earlier hesitation and the chilling dismissal from Detective Riley. His father had suspected corruption within the department, even back then. He'd been operating alone, trying to expose something vast and dangerous. Kyle felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, quickly followed by a surge of furious clarity. His father hadn't just been investigating a criminal enterprise. He'd been investigating a criminal enterprise that had reached its tendrils into the very heart of the town's law enforcement. Daniel Stone hadn't been an accident victim. He had been a threat. And someone connected to Wade Blackwood, someone his father couldn't trust, had made sure the threat was eliminated. The old roads, dusty and forgotten, now felt like a roadmap to a brutal truth. The old logbook, clutched tight in Kyle's hand, felt like a live wire, humming with the untold story of his father's final days. Wade Blackwood. The name was no longer just a newspaper footnote. It was a target. Kyle knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that if he wanted to understand what truly happened to Daniel Stone, Blackwood was where he had to start. Finding Blackwood wasn't difficult. His ranch, sprawling across thousands of acres, lay just outside Redemption Ridge, a monument to the kind of wealth that whispered of backroom deals and unspoken power. The property was well maintained, with freshly painted fences and sleek modern vehicles parked near a grand, imposing main house that seemed entirely out of place in this dusty, forgotten landscape. This was not the home of an honest rancher. Kyle drove his rental car up the long gravel driveway, the crunching stones announcing his arrival. He felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a police station with its predictable rules. This was Blackwood's territory, and the man's reputation, even after 30 years, preceded him. The desert wind, usually a calming force, seemed to whistle a warning through the open windows. He parked near a large, polished pickup truck and stepped out. The silence of the ranch was almost unsettling, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of dry grass. Before he could reach the front door, a man emerged from the shade of the porch. He was tall, with a lean, hard build, graying temples, and eyes like chips of flint. This had to be Blackwood. He carried himself with an air of authority, a subtle arrogance that hinted at years of getting his own way. "Can I help you?" Wade Blackwood's voice was gravelly, surprisingly deep, a stark contrast to the quiet of the ranch. His tone wasn't openly hostile, but it carried an unmistakable edge of territoriality, like a rattlesnake warning. "Mr. Blackwood, my name is Kyle Stone," Kyle began, trying to project a confidence he didn't quite feel. "I'm Daniel Stone's son." At the mention of his father's name, Blackwood's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable. Surprise, recognition, annoyance, crossing his face before settling back into a mask of disinterest. His eyes, however, sharpened, studying Kyle with an unnerving intensity. "Stone," Blackwood repeated as if tasting the name. "Officer Stone. Yes, I remember him. Tragic business, that." His words were calm, almost too calm. "What brings you to my ranch, son? Looking for old memories?" "I'm looking for answers, Mr. Blackwood," Kyle stated, his voice gaining strength. "My father was investigating you before he disappeared. Specifically, your hauling business and Operation Copperhead." The air between them seemed to crackle. A subtle tension rippled through Blackwood's frame, though his face remained impassive. His lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Operation Copperhead? That was a long time ago. A lot of smoke, not much fire, as I recall. And my hauling business is entirely legitimate, Mr. Stone. Always has been. Your father was a diligent man, certainly, but sometimes diligence can lead you down the wrong path." His gaze dropped to Kyle's hands, lingering for a fraction of a second on the backpack slung over his shoulder, as if calculating what information Kyle might be carrying. The implied warning was clear. "You're out of your depth, boy." "My father's personal notes suggest otherwise," Kyle pressed, pushing his luck. "He had a source, someone who told him about a large shipment through the canyon, the night he vanished. Someone who said you were personally overseeing it." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, no longer veiled. The flint chips had become shards of ice. He took a slow step closer, his presence suddenly more imposing. "You know, Mr. Stone, this desert can be a dangerous place. Memories can play tricks on people, and sometimes poking into old wounds can cause more trouble than it's worth, for everyone involved." His voice had dropped, now a low, guttural murmur that resonated with an unspoken threat. "Your father found that out the hard way." A chill ran down Kyle's spine, a cold dread that went beyond mere intimidation. Blackwood hadn't denied anything. Instead, he had issued a thinly veiled warning, a chilling confirmation that he knew far more than he was letting on. The subtle shift in his demeanor, the almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles, spoke volumes. This wasn't a man protecting his reputation. This was a man protecting a deep, dark secret. "Consider this a friendly piece of advice, Mr. Stone," Blackwood concluded, his gaze never leaving Kyle's. "Go back to wherever you came from. Forget about your father's investigations. Some things are best left buried, for your own good. As Blackwood turned and walked back into the imposing house, the door closing with a soft, final click, Kyle stood there, the silence of the ranch pressing in on him. His heart hammered against his ribs. The encounter had been short, but impactful. He hadn't just felt a threat. He'd felt the chilling, undeniable presence of the truth. His father's disappearance was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated act, and Wade Blackwood was at its very heart. The old roads, indeed, led to dangerous places. The encounter with Wade Blackwood had been a visceral shock, a cold confirmation of Kyle's deepest fears. The casual menace in Blackwood's eyes, the veiled warning, spoke volumes. This wasn't just a powerful businessman. This was a man who operated with impunity. Someone who considered himself beyond the reach of the law. And the chilling implication that his father had found out the hard way echoed in Kyle's mind, a constant, unsettling drumbeat. He knew he couldn't return to the sheriff's department. They had made their stance clear. He needed to find someone outside of the official circles, someone who remembered Redemption Ridge before it became a ghost town, someone who wasn't afraid to speak. He remembered a small, independent bookstore he'd seen on his way into town, nestled between two boarded-up shops. It seemed a strange survivor in such a forgotten place. Perhaps, he thought, a place of quiet knowledge, where stories, even the uncomfortable ones, were kept. The bell above the door jingled softly as Kyle stepped inside, and the comforting scent of aged paper and strong coffee filled the air. Shelves groaned under the weight of countless books, spilling into narrow aisles. Behind a worn wooden counter, a woman with a shock of vibrant silver hair pulled back in a messy bun peered at him over the top of a pair of half-moon reading glasses. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to take in everything at once. "Well now," she drawled, a faint friendly smile playing on her lips. "Don't see many new faces around here. Looking for a good read, or just escaping the dust?" "Just escaping the dust, mostly," Kyle replied, a genuine smile touching his own lips for the first time in days. "Though I wouldn't mind a good read. My name's Kyle Stone." Her smile faded slightly, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Stone? Any relation to Daniel Stone? The officer? From back in '85? Kyle nodded. "He was my father." The woman's eyes softened with a touch of sadness. "Ah, Daniel. He was a good man. Salt of the earth. I'm Eleanor Vance. Most folks call me Ellie. I ran the local newspaper for nearly 40 years before it went under. Saw a lot of things come and go in this town." She gestured to an old, comfortable armchair near a window. "Have a seat, son. Can I get you some coffee?" As Ellie poured 2 steaming mugs of coffee, the aroma a welcome comfort, Kyle felt a glimmer of hope. This woman knew things. He explained his discovery of the car, the lack of remains, his father's logbook, and the terse exchange with Blackwood and the sheriff's department. Ellie listened intently, her gaze never leaving his face, occasionally nodding slowly. "Wade Blackwood," Ellie finally said, her voice laced with a quiet disdain, "that man has always been a snake. Came to town in the late '70s, a smooth talker with pockets full of cash and a hunger for more. Started with a small mining claim, then expanded like wildfire. But he didn't do it clean. Not ever." She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes distant, lost in memory. "Back then, Redemption Ridge was wilder, less oversight. The county commissioners were easily bought or easily intimidated, and Blackwood was very good at both. He systematically bought up land, pushing out small-time miners, anyone who stood in his way. He used strong-arm tactics, manipulated property values. People disappeared, or their businesses mysteriously failed if they crossed him. "And the police?" Kyle asked, his voice low. Ellie sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound. "Some were honest, like your father. Too honest. Others, well, they looked the other way. Or they benefited. Money has a way of blinding people, son. Especially in a desperate town." Her gaze met his, sharp and direct. "Your father was digging into Blackwood's real business, the smuggling. He was trying to prove Blackwood was using his hauling trucks to move more than just ore out of the canyons. And he was getting close." "He wrote about a source, Whisper," Kyle revealed, watching her closely. Ellie's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flash of recognition. "Whisper. Yes. That was his code name for an informant. Someone on the inside. I heard whispers myself back then, through my own sources. Someone connected to Blackwood's operation who got cold feet. Daniel was putting together a case, trying to get enough evidence to bring it to the state. He didn't trust anyone local to handle it." "So it wasn't just an accident," Kyle said, the words a raw confirmation. Ellie shook her head slowly. "No, Kyle. Your father was silenced. Blackwood wasn't just going to let him expose his empire. He was too powerful, too well-connected. And he had eyes everywhere, even in the sheriff's department. There were always rumors that someone tipped Blackwood off about Daniel's investigation, about the meeting at the lookout." A cold, hard knot formed in Kyle's stomach. The truth, finally laid bare, was far more brutal than any official report. His father hadn't simply vanished. He had been betrayed, caught in a web of greed and corruption, sacrificed on the altar of small-town secrets. Ellie's words painted a vivid, chilling picture of a town held in the grip of fear, where justice was a luxury few could afford, and a good man's integrity became his death warrant. Ellie Vance's words had been a cold, hard splash of reality. The town of Redemption Ridge wasn't just forgotten. It was complicit, a silent accomplice in the disappearance of Daniel Stone. The revelations about Blackwood's true operations and the suspected internal corruption within the sheriff's department solidified Kyle's resolve. He wasn't just searching for a body anymore. He was fighting for his father's memory, for the truth that had been systematically buried. He knew his next step had to be finding Whisper, the anonymous source from his father's logbook. If Whisper was still alive, they held a key piece of the puzzle. Ellie, with her decades of local journalism, was the perfect starting point. Whisper, Ellie had mused, her eyes distant, was a tricky one. Daniel never told me a name, but he implied it was someone close to Blackwood's operation. Someone who had a conscience, or got squeezed too hard. They were always careful, used drop points, burner phones. Never met in person, as far as I know. Kyle pored over old city directories, cross-referencing names that had worked for Blackwood's hauling company or were connected to the mining operations in the early 80s. It was a tedious, almost impossible task. Many names were common, many had moved away, and many, Ellie confirmed, had disappeared over the years, either literally or simply faded into the vastness of the desert. Then a name caught his eye, one that appeared sporadically in the old local papers, always in connection with minor skirmishes or local bar fights. Silas Croft. Silas had been a heavy equipment operator for Blackwood's hauling company in 1985. Ellie remembered him. A quiet man, kept to himself, always seemed a little scared, but he worked the night shifts on those haul routes. It was a shot in the dark, but it was a lead. Kyle found an address for Silas in an even older directory, a small, dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of Redemption Ridge, nestled amongst rusted-out vehicles and overgrown weeds. It was the kind of place people forgot existed. The air around Silas Croft's trailer felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else Kyle couldn't quite place, a metallic tang, like old rust. As Kyle approached, a mangy dog barked half-heartedly from beneath a porch that looked ready to collapse. He knocked on the flimsy screen door. A thin, hunched man with sparse gray hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much peered out. His face was a road map of wrinkles, etched by years of sun and worry. This had to be Silas. He clutched a can of cheap beer, his hand trembling slightly. "Can I help you?" Silas's voice was raspy, laced with suspicion. "Mr. Croft? My name is Kyle Stone, Daniel Stone's son." At the mention of the name, Silas's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear passing through them. He tried to close the door, but Kyle quickly put his foot in the way, his voice urgent. "Please, Mr. Croft. I know my father was investigating Wade Blackwood. I know he had a source, and I think that source was you." Silas flinched, pulling back as if struck. His eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. "You should leave, boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This ain't your fight. Some things are best left alone." "My father didn't leave it alone," Kyle countered, his voice firm, infused with the emotion of his quest. "He died because he didn't. And I won't either. Not until I know what happened." He pulled out the logbook, opening it to the page with "Whisper" written on it. He wrote about a large shipment through Copperhead Canyon, the night he vanished. "Did you tell him about it, Mr. Croft? Did you tell him about Blackwood and that shipment?" Silas's gaze fell upon the familiar handwriting in the logbook, and his bravado crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and he sagged against the doorframe, his face a mask of profound weariness. "He was a good man, your daddy," Silas rasped, his voice filled with a desperate, raw regret. "Too good for this place. I told him everything I knew. I saw things, heard things. Blackwood was running more than just minerals. Drugs, weapons, things they didn't want anyone to find." Tears welled in Silas's eyes, old tears held back for decades. "I saw him that night, Mr. Stone. Your father. He was waiting at the lookout point. Blackwood's men. They were already there. They knew he was coming. Someone tipped them off." The words hit Kyle like a physical blow, a confirmation of Ellie's suspicions and his own growing dread. His father had walked into a trap. "What happened, Mr. Croft?" Kyle pleaded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What did you see?" Silas looked around again, a primal fear etched on his face. "I can't. They'll kill me. They killed your father. They'll kill me, too." "They can't hurt you anymore," Kyle argued, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "It's been 30 years. Blackwood's still powerful, but he's not omnipotent. Tell me, Silas. For my father. For the truth." Silas hesitated, a war raging in his eyes between fear and the burden of 3 decades of guilt. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he opened the screen door wider. "Come in, son," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll tell you what I saw. But you gotta promise me. You gotta promise me they won't find out I talked." Kyle stepped across the threshold, the air in the trailer thick with the weight of untold secrets. He had found his witness, and the truth, he knew, was about to unravel, one agonizing piece at a time. Silas Croft's trailer was small and cramped, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words and the lingering smell of stale cigarettes. As Kyle settled onto a creaky armchair, the silence stretched, thick with Silas's visible fear. The old man took a deep, shaky breath, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the grimy window, as if reliving a nightmare. "It was the night he disappeared," Silas began, his voice a raspy whisper that cracked with emotion. "November 12th. I was on the late shift, hauling equipment for Blackwood. My route took me right past the old lookout, same as always. But that night was different." He paused, a shiver running through his gaunt frame. "I saw your daddy's cruiser parked at the lookout, just like he said it would be. He was meeting his whisper. I was that whisper. I told him about a big run that night, a special one. Not just ore, Mr. Stone. Cash, guns, even some of those new designer drugs coming up from Mexico. Blackwood was expecting a big payday." Silas's eyes, full of unshed tears, met Kyle's. "I saw a couple of Blackwood's enforcers already there. Not the usual crew. These were tougher, out-of-towners. I knew right then something was wrong. They weren't just waiting for a delivery. They were waiting for him." A cold wave of dread washed over Kyle. His father had been set up. "I tried to warn him," Silas continued, his voice breaking. "I flashed my lights, a couple of quick blinks, tried to signal him to turn around. But he was already getting out of his car, walking towards them. He was so focused on getting the proof, he didn't see the trap." "What happened then?" Kyle urged, his breath shallow. "They grabbed him," Silas whispered, clenching his fists. "Fast, before he could even reach for his weapon. They subdued him, roughed him up. I saw them talking, yelling. Then Blackwood himself showed up in a separate vehicle. A big black SUV, not his usual truck. He looked furious." Silas shuddered, closing his eyes. "Blackwood was screaming at your father, calling him a fool, a meddling cop. He said Daniel knew too much. And then he pulled a gun." Kyle's blood ran cold. "He shot him?" "No," Silas rasped, opening his eyes, which were now wide with horror. "Not right away. Blackwood wanted to make an example. He wanted to send a message. He told his men to tie your father up, to put him in the trunk of his own patrol car. Daniel was fighting, of course, but there were too many of them." The image seared itself into Kyle's mind. His father, the strong, principled officer, helpless, forced into the trunk of his own cruiser. The indignity, the terror. Then Blackwood got in his SUV. His men got into another truck. And they used a winch from their truck. They hooked it to your father's cruiser, and they pushed it. Slowly at first, then faster. Right over the edge of Copperhead Canyon. The sound of the metal tearing, the crunch of rock. It was horrific. Silas buried his face in his hands, trembling. "I sped away. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want them to see me. I was terrified. I knew if they found out I told your father, I'd be next." Kyle felt a chilling clarity descend upon him. It wasn't an accident. It was a cold-blooded execution, disguised as one. And the reason there were no remains in the car? "They took him out of the trunk, didn't they?" Kyle said, his voice flat, the realization a sickening twist in his gut. "Before they pushed the car." Silas slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting Kyle's, filled with the confirmation of his worst fears. "Yes, they pulled him out just before the car went over. Blackwood, he said something. Something about sending a message. About not finding the body so no one would ever know for sure. He said they'd make him disappear completely. They drove off in the opposite direction from the canyon with him. I never saw him again. I swear it, Mr. Stone. I never saw what they did with him after that. I just I just kept driving." The silence in the trailer was profound, punctuated only by Silas's ragged breathing. Daniel Stone hadn't died in the crash. He had been taken, executed elsewhere, his body disposed of in a way that defied discovery for decades. His car was merely a macabre prop in a staged accident, a smokescreen to cover a far more heinous crime. The question of trap or sacrifice was answered. It was a trap, brutally sprung, and his father, even in his final moments, had been denied the dignity of a proper end. The chilling efficiency of Blackwood's actions, the sheer audacity of it, left Kyle speechless, his mind reeling with the brutal reality of his father's final moments. Silas Croft's chilling account left Kyle numb, a profound emptiness settling in his gut. The story of his father being taken, his cruiser a mere diversion, was a far more brutal truth than any accident. Yet a sliver of hope, sharp and painful, remained. If Daniel hadn't died in the canyon, then where? And how had his body remained hidden for so long? Silas's limited view had ended with his father being driven away, but Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that the canyon still held a deeper, more personal secret. Armed with Silas's terrified whispers and his father's cryptic logbook, Kyle returned to the canyon. This time, he didn't go with Sheriff Miller or the official recovery teams. He went alone, a battered backpack slung over his shoulder, a compass in hand, and a grim determination setting his jaw. He sought not the obvious crash site, but the places Blackwood's men wouldn't expect anyone to look, the hidden ledges, the forgotten crevices, the ancient labyrinthine paths known only to those intimately familiar with the desert's treacherous embrace. He remembered a fleeting entry in his father's logbook, a detail he hadn't fully understood until now. Whisper's emergency drop point, South Fork, below the old Indian caves. It was a place Silas had mentioned as a potential rendezvous if their regular meeting point was compromised. A small, almost invisible path that snaked down the canyon wall, far from the main road and the overlook. The descent was arduous, the sun beating down relentlessly, the air thick with dust. Loose scree shifted beneath his boots, threatening to send him tumbling into the abyss. He scraped his hands, bruised his knees, but the adrenaline fueled him, pushing him forward. He imagined his father, trapped, knowing his time was limited, desperately trying to get to this secret spot, to hide something, anything that could expose Blackwood. He found the old Indian caves after nearly 2 hours of precarious climbing. Not large caves, but shallow overhangs in the sandstone, barely noticeable from the rim above. They were used by ancient tribes for shelter, hidden from sight, easily defensible. And below them, after a particularly steep, rock-strewn scramble, lay a small, relatively flat ledge, overgrown with desert scrub. And there, partially concealed by a gnarled juniper bush, was a crude cairn of rocks. It was old, weathered, but deliberately constructed. A shiver ran down Kyle's spine. This wasn't natural. His hands shaking, Kyle began to carefully dismantle the cairn, stone by stone. The silence of the canyon pressed in on him, broken only by his ragged breathing and the whisper of the wind. With each rock he moved, the hope and dread inside him warred. Finally, he reached the bottom. There, partially covered by sand and the last remaining flat stone, were the bleached fragments of bone. A human skull, fractured but recognizable. A few ribs. A femur. They were not neatly arranged, but scattered, as if the body had been roughly thrown or dragged. And nestled among the bones, almost invisible against the red earth, was a single tarnished object, a small tarnished silver locket, the kind his mother had given his father on their wedding day, engraved with their initials. Kyle dropped to his knees, the dust rising around him. Tears blurred his vision, hot and stinging. He reached out, his fingers tracing the familiar faded initials on the locket. This was it. This was him, his father. But as he stared at the remains, a deeper understanding, horrifying and agonizing, began to dawn. There were no bullet holes in the skull, no obvious signs of a direct fatal blow. The bones showed evidence of severe blunt force trauma consistent with a fall, or being struck by heavy, jagged objects. The scattered nature suggested a struggle, or a desperate attempt to move. He scanned the immediate area, his eyes now sharpened by the brutal truth. Just a few feet away, he saw it, a small, almost undetectable fissure in the canyon wall, leading to a narrow, crumbling ledge. It was a route that could offer a desperate escape or a perilous trap. Suddenly, a new, more horrifying scenario clicked into place. Silas had seen them take his father out of the trunk, but he hadn't seen what happened next. What if, after being removed from the car, Daniel, disoriented and injured, had made a desperate run for it? He knew these canyons. He might have seen the old emergency drop point, tried to reach it, to hide, to make one last attempt to evade Blackwood's men. Perhaps, in his injured state, trying to navigate the treacherous terrain, he had fallen. A broken limb, a head injury, bleeding. He wouldn't have been able to call for help, deep in this forgotten part of the canyon. Blackwood's men, knowing he was hurt and in an impossible location, wouldn't have needed to finish him off. They might have simply left him to die, knowing the desert would claim him, and then, after a respectful period of time, returned to hide the remains, to ensure the body was never found and the truth never exposed. They didn't need to kill him. They just needed to make sure no one would ever find him alive. And then, once he was gone, they could stage the car crash to cement the narrative of an accident. This was the chilling reality. His father hadn't been murdered in cold blood on the spot. He had been trapped, yes. But then he had fought. He had run. He had tried to escape, perhaps even carrying vital evidence on him before succumbing to his injuries or the elements. His body then hidden by Blackwood's men to erase any trace. They had given him a crueler fate than a quick death, a desperate, lonely end, lost to the unforgiving wilderness, with his truth buried with him. The weight of this realization was crushing, but with it came a strange, fierce clarity. Kyle had found his father, not the live, vibrant man, but the final silent witness to a decades-old crime. And now he had the undeniable evidence needed to finally expose Wade Blackwood and the dark secrets of Redemption Ridge. The canyon had kept its secret for 30 years, but it had finally, agonizingly, given up its truth. The locket clutched in Kyle's hand felt impossibly heavy, a tangible link to a past that had just roared into agonizing focus. The discovery of his father's remains, the understanding of his desperate, lonely end, had ripped open old wounds, but also cauterized them with the harsh fire of truth. He hadn't just found bones. He'd found a story of a principled man caught in the unforgiving machinations of power and greed. Back in Redemption Ridge, the first person Kyle called was Sheriff Miller. He met the sheriff at the station, not in the public lobby, but in a small private office. The door closed against the whispers of the department. Kyle laid out the evidence with a calm born of exhaustion and resolute purpose. The locket, the detailed entries from Daniel's logbook, and most damningly, Silas Croft's terrified, yet ultimately truthful testimony. Miller listened intently, his face a grim mask. He picked up the locket, turning it over in his calloused fingers. his gaze lingering on the worn initials. He read through Daniel's logbook, his eyes narrowing at the entries concerning Blackwood and the emergency drop point. When Kyle recounted Silas's eyewitness account, the sheriff's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching rhythmically. "Silas Croft," Miller murmured, almost to himself. "Poor old Silas. He always seemed to carry a burden, but I never could get him to talk." He looked up at Kyle, his eyes now holding a mix of regret and steely determination. "This changes everything, Kyle. This isn't just a missing person anymore. This is cold-blooded murder, 30 years in the making, and a massive cover-up." The sheriff wasted no time. With Kyle's evidence and the new lead provided by Silas, a quiet but relentless investigation began. Sheriff Miller bypassed his own department's internal politics, reaching out directly to the Arizona State Police Cold Case Unit and the District Attorney's Office. He explained the sensitive nature of the case, the potential for local corruption, and the need for absolute discretion. The state investigators, armed with Kyle's findings, moved swiftly and methodically. They secured Silas Croft's full formal statement, offering him protection in exchange for his testimony. The detailed logs from Daniel's notebook provided a blueprint for Blackwood's operations. The forensic team returned to the canyon, guided by Kyle, and meticulously excavated the site of the remains, finally bringing Daniel Stone home. The net tightened around Wade Blackwood. He was a pillar of the community, seemingly untouchable. But the weight of 30 years of accumulated secrets, combined with Silas's eyewitness account and the undeniable physical evidence of Daniel's hidden resting place, became too much. The legal maneuvers were complex, the resistance fierce. Blackwood had money, influence, and a history of intimidation. But he couldn't deny the truth when it stared him in the face, backed by irrefutable evidence. The arrest of Wade Blackwood wasn't a dramatic televised spectacle. It was a quiet, almost understated affair, carried out by state agents, away from the prying eyes of Redemption Ridge. He was taken into custody on charges related to the murder of Officer Daniel Stone and multiple counts of racketeering and illicit trafficking, unearthed by a renewed investigation into his old businesses. The town buzzed with muted shock, but also for some, a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. For Kyle, the moment of Blackwood's arrest wasn't a triumph. It was a profound exhale. He watched the news reports from the solitude of his motel room. The face of the man who had orchestrated his father's vanishing act finally brought to justice. It didn't bring Daniel back, but it stripped away the agonizing shroud of uncertainty. The truth, however brutal, had a clarity to it that the unknown never could. Later that week, Kyle stood with his mother, Sarah, at a small private memorial service. Daniel Stone's name was finally etched onto a headstone, not as a missing officer, but as a dedicated public servant whose life had been taken in the line of duty, his remains finally recovered. The small gathering of family and a few old friends, including Ellie Vance and Sheriff Miller, offered quiet condolences. There was no grand pronouncement, no public parade. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a wrong finally righted. As Kyle looked at his mother's face, seeing the fragile peace that had settled there after decades of torment, he felt it. The closure he had desperately sought. The burden he had carried for so long, the ghost of his father's unsolved disappearance, finally lifted. The price of truth was immense, paid in 30 years of grief and unwavering determination. But standing there, under the vast open sky of Redemption Ridge, Kyle knew it was a price worth paying. The desert light, once harsh and unforgiving, now seemed to hold a gentler quality for Kyle. The immediate aftermath of Blackwood's arrest, the quiet memorial, the conversations with Sheriff Miller and Ellie Vance had drained him, leaving him profoundly exhausted. But beneath the fatigue lay a new, unfamiliar sensation: peace. The gnawing ache in his soul, the constant unresolved question of his father's fate, had finally blessedly ceased. He packed his bags in the motel room, the last vestiges of his temporary life in Redemption Ridge. The old logbook, now a historical document rather than a cryptic puzzle, was carefully tucked away, alongside the silver locket. He looked out the window at the familiar dusty main street. It was still a quiet town, still struggling, but the heavy shroud of its darkest secret had finally been lifted. The air felt cleaner, lighter. He decided not to rush back to his life in the city. Instead, he drove out to Copperhead Canyon one last time. He didn't go to the overlook or the secret ledge where Daniel's remains had been found. He drove to a quieter spot, a less dramatic vista, and simply sat on a rock, watching the shadows lengthen across the ancient landscape. His father hadn't been a superhero. He was a dedicated cop, a man who believed in right and wrong, and who had underestimated the depth of the darkness he was fighting. He had died a lonely, desperate death, not in a blaze of glory, but in a hidden crevice, betrayed and left for dead. And yet, in his final, agonizing struggle, he had held on to that locket, that tangible piece of his family, a silent testament to the love that had defined his life. That, Kyle realized, was its own kind of heroism. He thought of his mother, Sarah. The phone call, just yesterday, had been tearful, but not from sorrow, from relief. She had finally grieved, finally found a measure of peace she hadn't known in 3 decades. The truth, however painful, had set them both free. Kyle stayed in Redemption Ridge for another week, not actively investigating, but simply existing, allowing the new reality to settle. He had coffee with Ellie Vance, listening to her quiet stories of the town's past, of the good people who had tried to make a difference, like his father. He spoke with Sheriff Miller, who, now free from the decades-long burden of an unsolved, unspoken truth, seemed to stand a little straighter. He realized something profound during that time. Redemption Ridge wasn't just a place where darkness had reigned. It was also a place where a good man had fought for what was right, and where, eventually, the truth had clawed its way to the surface. It was a place that, despite its scars, still held a quiet dignity. The thought of returning to his life in the city, to the endless lines of code and predictable outcomes, suddenly felt hollow. He had spent his professional life building systems, but here he had helped to rebuild something far more important: justice. He considered the future. He wasn't a cop, and he didn't want to be. But the pursuit of truth, the quiet work of uncovering hidden narratives, resonated deeply. He didn't make any grand declarations. He simply decided to stay, for now. There were still old cases in Sheriff Miller's office, still stories Ellie Vance knew from her days as a reporter. He wouldn't wear a badge, but he could use his analytical mind, his persistence to perhaps help others find their own forms of closure. He could assist. He could contribute. He could be a silent force for good, much like his father had been in his own way. As the sun set, painting the Redemption Ridge sky in fiery oranges and purples, Kyle stood on the porch of his childhood home. The overgrown garden no longer seemed daunting. He imagined planting new flowers, bringing life back to this once neglected space. The quiet of the evening was no longer heavy with unanswered questions, but peaceful, filled with the promise of a future shaped by hard-won truth. The long pursuit was over. The echoes in the canyon had finally been heard. And for Kyle Stone, a new life, unburdened by the ghosts of the past, had finally begun.